travel deep into the southeast corner of what today is the province of Alberta, and you will find yourself in the area known as the Palliser Triangle. Named for Irish-born geographer and explorer John Palliser, it was the expedition he led between 1857 and 1860 which reported back to the Canadian government that this region was too arid to be of use for agriculture purposes. Travel through the area today, and you can see he was probably right. Starting near the village of Sterling in the west and heading east along Highway 61, you are roughly following the path taken by the Northwest Mounted Police during their Great March of 1874. Mind you, they were heading the opposite way, coming from Fort Dufferin near Winnipeg to the whiskey outpost of Fort Whoop-Up near what today is the city of Lethbridge. Highway 61 forms part of the Redcoat Trail, the roughly 1,300-kilometer path across the prairies which follows their trek. In terms of the landscape, not much has changed in the last century and a half. You are still crossing flat, arid prairie with the Sweetgrass Hills sitting across the U.S. border to the south, providing the only visual relief on the otherwise flat horizon. Oh, you'll see signs of civilization along the way. In Wrentham, you'll find 2 grain elevators, both standing tall and proud. On what was once the main street, you'll find Ron's General Store, but don't count on stopping there for supplies. Long since closed and abandoned to the elements, today it sits for sale. Land value only, says the real estate listing. Buildings are deemed to be structurally unsound and unsafe to enter. Further along, you'll pass Skiff, another grain elevator, this one in a unique yellow color, and the abandoned farm equipment shop. Like the general store in Wrentham, this one too sits silently awaiting its seemingly inevitable fate. There isn't much of a market here for anyone looking to open a new business in this old building. Before long, you'll find yourself in Foremost. At around 500 people, Foremost is the, well, pardon the pun, foremost community in this area. You can find everything you need here, even a restaurant or two if you come through on the right day at the right time. Compared to the settlements you've seen since leaving Lethbridge, this place is positively booming. Why, they even have a modern concrete buffalo slope grain elevator to complement their traditional wooden crib one. Yes, old man Palliser had no idea what he was talking about. Things are hopping here in the heart of the county of 40 Mile. How hopping? Why, in the next town you encounter on your way east, you'll find a sign saying, Future Home of Kmart. Yes, you've reached Nemiskam, Alberta, and apparently someone here has big dreams, or more likely a big sense of humor. The sign has been there for as long as anyone can remember, and I don't even know if anyone knows who put it there in the first place. What I do know is that taking a photo of it is a rite of passage for all ghost towners who pass this way. There aren't many signs of prosperity in Nemiskam. Closed down businesses and the old schoolhouse, which appears to have been converted to a granary by a local farmer. There are no students to get up to mischief here, just tons and tons of mice. Next stop, tiny Etzikom. How tiny is Etzikom? It's small enough that they can list the names of each member of the high school graduating class on the town's sign. We used to joke that in places this small, that when a fire starts in the bathroom, the fire department will put it out before it reaches the house. One thing that isn't tiny here, though, is the Etzikom Museum and Canadian National Historic Windmill Center. Apparently, this is the only windmill museum in Canada, and here it sits, off in an oft-forgotten corner of the province. What a great surprise for those making their Highway 61 sojourn. You never know what you might find around the next corner, and this proves it. And finally, we reach Orion. Orion is small enough to make Etzikom seem like New York, or at least Lethbridge. Orion is the main subject of our video, and it's taken us a long time to get here. But that's what travel is like on the back roads. It's never about the destination. It's always about the journey. But with our journey behind us now, we can wander the streets of Orion. Established in 1916 by the Canadian Pacific Railway as a siding on the Stirling subdivision, the town was apparently originally known as Needmore, but was changed to Orion, likely in reference to the constellation. With the lack of light pollution in these parts, the constellations certainly do shine brighter here. At its peak, Orion boasted somewhere between 300 and 400 residents and about 30 businesses. Today, you can likely wander the dusty streets and not see anyone, although I believe the inhabitants still number somewhere in the single digits. In this country, grasshoppers outnumber the people by a wide margin. Silent and forgotten sits the old playground, its equipment rusting away in the southern Alberta sun. Instead of the laughter of children, the only sound emanating from it today comes from an overly enthusiastic ghost towner, a child at heart who is willing to risk burning his legs on the hot metal of the slide to just capture a piece of his lost childhood. Speaking of lost pieces, one place you won't find in Orion anymore is the old Stevens Hardware and Garage building. From the outside, it was a rather nondescript wooden building, typical of the type of construction common in the early 20th century on the Canadian prairies. My understanding is that it was actually a former schoolhouse, moved onto this site many decades ago. For many years, Stevens Hardware was a must-stop for ghost towners in this area. Probably the most photographed hardware store in the province. What made this place special was not the wood-frame building, but the man who was synonymous with it. Indeed, synonymous with the entire town of Orion. For it is impossible to talk about Orion without talking about the hardware store, and you can't talk about the hardware store without talking about Boyd Stevens. Born in 1936, Boyd pretty much spent his entire life in Orion. In 1954, he started working in the hardware store alongside his father, Howard Stevens. Howard would retire in 1988, leaving Boyd to carry on the business. Boyd was the unofficial caretaker and mayor of Orion. If he wasn't already holding court in his store, the sight of a ghost towner wandering the streets of the town would be enough to get him to emerge from his house and shuffle down to greet you. Almost anyone who ever ghost towned through this countryside has a story about meeting Boyd and engaging him in conversation for as long as you wanted. Even after 60 years, he would happily unlock the door to the hardware store and lead you inside to check out the wares. On Christmas Day in 2016, word started circulating on social media in the various ghost town and historic places groups. The unthinkable had happened. Stevens Hardware and Garage had burned to the ground. With no fire department for miles around and the old wooden construction of the building, there was nothing anyone could do. Fire has been the enemy of the frontier prairie town forever, and the hardware store in Orion was merely its latest victim. Fortunately, we were relieved to learn that Boyd himself was unharmed and doing as well as one could expect for someone who had just lost his life's work. After that, Boyd was seen less and less in Orion. With the store gone and age catching up with him, he began spending more and more time at a senior's lodge in nearby Bow Island. Finally, on May the 22nd, 2023, Boyd passed away and closed the final chapter on his legacy. He was laid to rest in Medicine Hat in the same cemetery as his parents, Howard and Winifred. While the constellation Orion continues to shine brightly over the Alberta prairie, the little town of Orion grew just a little bit dimmer. If you believe in the paranormal, you won't have any doubts that the caretaker of Orion is still out there, still keeping an eye on the place, and maybe, just maybe, if you're really lucky and you time it just right, you might just feel his spirit wanting to sit down with you and have another conversation at the site of Boyd's hardware store.